This video is brought to you by me. Unfortunately, I am not fabulous enough to have a sponsor, but maybe one day I'll be rich and famous. Until then, I'll just stick to my hobby, educating myself about the things that interest me. Austria and Hungary has had a peculiar relationship for at least the last 700 years. When the Kingdom of Hungary was formed around 1000 AD, Austria didn't exist as an independent entity, but as time went on, this part of the Holy Roman Empire became more important. One by one, these provinces were acquired by the House of Habsburg, a family that intended to expand their influence through marriage rather than military conquest. They started out in present-day Switzerland, then moved to Austria, and eventually they became Holy Roman Emperors and added both Bohemia and Hungary to their domain. From then on, a strange relationship developed between the German-Austrian and the Hungarian half of their empire, a relationship that could probably be best described as a dysfunctional marriage. This somewhat weird relationship exists even today, although in a lesser form. The two countries are not just neighbors. In a way, they represent the divided nature of Europe, forming the border between the western and the eastern half. How did this come about? This is what we will discuss in this video. Although the territories we call Austria today were always more developed than Hungary, back in the Middle Ages, they didn't have the prestige of the latter, which is why the Habsburgs would try again and again to get their hands on the crown of Hungary. Going back 800 years, we don't even see Austria on the map, while Hungary is a significant regional power, neighboring the German Empire and Poland. By 1360 AD, things were changing. Germany was already divided, and regional lords became more influential. In the southeastern corner of the empire, we see the hereditary lands, covering today's Austria and Slovenia, as a separate entity. Its core was the Archduchy of Austria, ruled by the Habsburgs, but through cleverly arranged marriages, they would soon form their own empire. Their initial attempts to expand into Hungary brought some success. Hungarian nobles elected two Habsburg kings in the 15th century, but then Matthias Corvinus, son of John Hunyadi, became king, and under his strong leadership, Hungary would attempt to dominate both Bohemia and Austria. He even added Vienna to his domain, but when he died, he was followed by weak rulers. When Hungary descended into chaos by the early 1500s, no longer able to stop the Ottoman incursions into Europe, Austria was expanding. The House of Habsburg now controlled the Holy Roman Empire. They also inherited the thrones of both Bohemia and Hungary. And while the Kingdom of Hungary would soon become a devastated battlefield, it survived, and its mere existence meant that German lands could not be occupied by the Turks. By that time, the Habsburgs also gained control of the Low Countries and Spain, which meant that they suddenly became the largest empire in the world, an inheritance on which the sun never set. One branch of the family ruled over Spain and its vast colonial empire until 1700, while the other branch controlled the Austrian, Bohemian, and Hungarian provinces. You would think that once these lands were united under one ruler, everything was fine and dandy, but this was never the case. Czech, Hungarian, and Austrian noblemen did not see the world through the same lens. Each parliament was pursuing its own interests, which very often went against the king's wishes. While the king obviously preferred a centralized form of government, these parliaments tried to preserve their own privileges. Most of the time, a compromise was needed because support of the parliaments was required to maintain some sort of fiscal balance, especially at times of war, when expenditures skyrocketed. The Habsburgs tried to maintain control over the Holy Roman Empire. In this they were successful, but the title meant less and less, as the empire became hopelessly fragmented by 1648. Over time, their focus turned to Hungary, as they tried to exert full authority over the kingdom that was finally reconquered and liberated from Ottoman rule by 1700. Just a few years after liberation, a revolution and war for independence broke out in Hungary. You may be surprised by this turn of events, but the main underlying reason was that in some respects, liberation was worse than Turkish domination. The court needed more tax revenues, especially when a new European war broke out over the Spanish succession, and while ordinary serfs were squeezed hard, many noble families were also disgruntled because the Habsburgs distributed the liberated lands among their loyal followers, instead of giving them back to their previous owners. The revolution ultimately failed, as no major European power would provide serious help to Hungarian rebels. The 18th century passed in relative peace. Hungary was resettled through mass immigration, while its parliament supported the House of Habsburg against Prussia, to the great surprise of pretty much everyone. Even though many still resented Austrian rule, it seemed to be the only logical option for Hungary's elite, who feared a possible Turkish resurgence or Russian oppression, especially as Poland was being carved up in front of their eyes. Being part of an important European power was still better than being conquered by someone else. Hungary's nobility backed their king against Napoleon as well, as the ideas of the French Revolution seemed alien to most of them. What's more, many landlords profited from the wars, but once these wars were over, opposing interests emerged once again. The Holy Roman Empire was gone. The Habsburgs rebranded themselves as the Empire of Austria, but the great question became, who was going to reunite Germany, which was now called the German Confederation. Before that happened, a new round of revolutions swept over Europe. By the 1840s, it was clear that change was needed. Old methods were no longer working. In Hungary, even the aristocracy was coming around. It was the dawn of nationalism, which meant that the language you spoke and your identity became more important than the name of your ruler. For a few months, survival of the Habsburgs as a ruling house was in question, but the great powers of Europe resisted change. They still thought that Austria was needed to maintain balance on the continent. Because of this, the 1848 revolutions failed, but a return to the previous era was no longer possible. Austria and Hungary were united once again, but ruling with an iron fist could only be maintained for a few years. The empire lost against France and Italy, then it was humiliated by Prussia in a lightning war, which allowed the unification of Germany under Prussian leadership. Austria was relegated to the sidelines. Though it was still a major player in Europe, it was no longer strong enough to focus on Germany, so its attention turned to the Balkans. However, the internal conflict had to be resolved first. It was clear that the Austrian Empire could survive only if the Hungarians cooperated. An agreement was finally achieved in 1867 when Austria-Hungary was formed, with 2 capitals and 2 parliaments. The Emperor of Austria was now also King of Hungary. He would have to deal with 2 prime ministers, who in return were responsible to their own governments. This was the structure upon which the new old empire was built, and it would stay the same until the last days of World War I. The subsequent half-century is probably the most interesting period in our story. It shows how 2 opposing factions can work together to ensure stability and preserve their own power. Although the Austrian part was somewhat more liberal, both governments tried to prevent further changes. To this end, ethnic minorities received only partial recognition. Their political representation could not be allowed to surpass the critical level. As long as Vienna and Budapest could maintain control, the country would stay united. Maybe not in the hearts and minds of all its inhabitants, but certainly in a political and territorial sense. A new agreement was signed every 10 years between the two governments concerning their financial contribution. Austria always bore more of the burden, as it was more developed economically. Tensions reached new highs with each successive agreement, but a compromise could always be found. In the background, a united Germany was lurking with its industrial and military might, eager to claim more territory both in and outside Europe. In fact, Germany was the greatest threat to the existence of Austria-Hungary, as it could swallow up the Austrian part and unite all Germans in the region, which is why the Austrian leadership quickly made an alliance with Germany, preventing the emergence of such thoughts in Berlin. Unfortunately for them, in the age of nationalism, Austria-Hungary had no future. They managed to preserve the unity of the empire for a few more decades, but by the end of the Great War, everybody wanted out. The only question was what form would the new independent countries take. As it turned out, Austria and Hungary both became small entities, each going its own way, without looking back. In the interwar period, Hungary was relatively stable, while Austria lacked a national identity that would unite the country. Parliament swung from left to right, with huge protests and even street fighting, until 1934, when a one-party state was created. The country was then annexed by Nazi Germany, which alarmed the government in Budapest. Hungary traditionally looked to its western neighbor to seek some sort of direction, which was true even in 2020 with the pandemic raging on, but suddenly that neighbor was gone. Once these two countries emerged from the ashes of World War II, they found themselves in a new world. In a few years, an Iron Curtain would separate them, which was also the frontier between the western and eastern half of the continent. In a way, the different paths of Austria and Hungary symbolize the politically and ideologically divided Europe. Despite this division, the two countries continued to have a somewhat closer relationship, which could only be suspended but not completely ruptured. Hungarians would continue to compare their own standard of living to that of Austrians. In their eyes, Austria was the example to follow. Even when they revolted against Soviet oppression in 1956, they wanted what Austria had at the time. It's also not a coincidence that the Iron Curtain was dismantled first between Austria and Hungary. The more lenient communist government in Budapest was losing control. They started to gradually open up the economy by the mid-1980s, which meant more and more Austrian and German businesses established their own connections in the country that was officially still part of the Eastern Bloc. Once the Berlin Wall fell, these former Soviet satellites had only one remaining option: join the community of European nations and rely on Western economic aid. Of course, aid very often means exploitation, which is why some of these countries are now moving away from Western liberal ideals. The Hungarian government may not agree on certain topics with their neighbor, but ordinary Hungarians continue to dream about a future in which they enjoy the same standard of living. For now, both countries will remain members of the same community, where matters can be settled more peacefully. We'll see what the future brings in the next few decades.